Hi, friends. Thanks to all of you who responded to the most recent video I did of some lessons I've learned from my students this week, our first week of classes at Elizabethtown College, and some application to the church. I had some additional reflections this week and kind of an epiphany. We've been talking so much about the devastating effects of the pandemic on our young people, and yet this week I had this experience, as I shared in the last video, of students who were just so much more fully engaged than they were last fall, or particularly last spring. I mean, there were times where I thought that that they were going to almost jump out of the monitor, out of the screen, faces full of hope and light and vigorous in their engagement, with chats running down the side. And I thought about some things I've written earlier in the podcast, The Church Dismantled, that I'm going to share and then add to it my reflections on this week. I've entitled this little clip, Parkinson's Disease Protest in a Pandemic, More Lessons from My Students. For years I've been telling my students that suffering is the very best teacher that we could ever have. After a lengthy marital separation, several bouts with cancer, falling off my roof, breaking my hip, Parkinson's disease, I'd like to say that I've earned the right to say that suffering is our best teacher. In any event, that's been true of the Parkinson's disease diagnosis for sure. She hasn't disappointed as a teacher. When I was first diagnosed in 2017, Valentine's Day, for that first year, I was devastated, raging and crying and angry. But Heidi and I, by God's grace, had organized a sabbatical for the summer and just needed some time to process ourselves without really telling many folks that this was the news that we were dealing with. And so we went out west, and one of the things we did was go to Seattle and visit Dale Chihuly's glass-blowing museum, which, if you've ever seen, is just outstanding. And one of the things I learned there about Chihuly was that he had become disabled at some point and had lost the ability, because of a dislocated shoulder, to continue to be in what he called what's called the gaffer position, to do the glass blowing. And so he also became blind in one eye. And what he did then was, instead of doing the glass blowing himself, he actually started putting onto paper, painting, sketching and painting what he saw in his mind that he would then give to his students to actually do the glass blowing. And it was, what was a disability on the one hand was really the next step in his maturation as an artist. Because now, for the first time, people were able to see, his students were able to see what was going on in his head, in his heart, as he put it on paper. Before, it had gone directly from him, his head and heart, into the glass. Now there was this mediating step, because of the disability, that others benefited from. And of course, these paintings went on to sell for thousands of dollars. And I began to understand that maybe a disability like Parkinson's was actually an opportunity to create a window into my own life and soul. Maybe to reveal some things about myself that would be useful to others that I had never been open to revealing before. And I think the podcasting that I started doing a year ago, in many ways, represented that kind of opportunity, or that kind of experience. The second thing that we did on that trip, or a second thing that was part of the lesson for me, again, about suffering as teacher, was go to the Northwest Forest in Washington, the Olympic National Forest. And it's beautiful, temperate, wet, tropical forest, but it's temperate. And huge trees, huge specimens, of course. If you've been there, you know what you see. It's gorgeous there. But the tree that attracted my attention was this tree that was bent. It was crooked. It had fallen, but had been resilient, and it had sustained its growth. And we had to walk under it, underneath the trail. It had no particular majesty of its own, but it drew its attention from the fact that we had to see it. We had to notice it. We had to walk under it. It wasn't dancing for us, or making faces for us, or impressing us with how beautiful and big it was, but it simply took our attention because it had been resilient. It had continued to persist, and we had to notice it. And so again, it was this moment for me of recognizing that having a disability or a disease like Parkinson's didn't mean that I was going to disappear. That in fact, there might be ways that out of the brokenness and the crookedness and the recognition of the flaws and the faults, that I might actually become more noticeable, useful, hopefully in positive ways for folks. The third one was a book that I was reading by Mark Buchanan on sabbatical, on Sabbath rest, sorry. And Mark talks about the fact that having a disability doesn't mean that we can't do some of the things that we still dreamed of doing, but he says it means that we're going to have to lean on the shoulder of a friend in order to get home. And I love that image because in our own marriage, Heidi has become for me in so many ways with Parkinson's now, that shoulder that I lean on, that I recognize in so many ways the need I have for this relationship that has always meant a lot to me. But there's a dependency that this disease has created and that will continue to create as simply will progress, that has shifted some things in our marriage that have been helpful and I think healthy and certainly good for me because I can be very independent and not dependent. I can be a lone ranger of sorts. And so this has forced me to recognize my dependence on others. And I think that's always a good thing. So at least for the last 3 years, but I think before that, because some would say when I pastored the first time at Elizabethtown Mennonite Church, the primary theme they heard from me, I was diagnosed with papillary thyroid cancer the first several months after my ordination and would struggle for 3 years after that. I think an ongoing theme they heard was that of suffering and the value of suffering. And it's true. It's been one of my major themes probably in the classroom, in the pulpit, because the most important lessons I've ever learned have come through the darkest times of my life. And so to say that suffering is the best teacher has become, again, a particular theme for me over the last 3 years that I've talked with my students about and reminded them that it's those who have recognized or experienced a world that's been fractured, that's had an earthquake to it, that are best able sociologically to see the world around them because they've been forced to recognize that they can't take the world for granted anymore. And that they actually have a leg up on those whose lives have been fairly stable, and that they're already ahead of the game in seeing the world from a marginalized perspective where they don't take it for granted. What's been interesting to me over this past week, in fact, one of the podcasts I did early last year, or in the middle of last year, was it was something like this: everybody's got Parkinson's disease, and what I meant was, as I looked around and heard people talk about the pandemic, it was as if they had some of the same concerns that we all have suddenly when we have a chronic illness or are afraid of getting an illness and so on. And that it was like the whole society was dealing with some of the stuff that I felt like I was dealing with when I had cancer or when I had Parkinson's disease and so on. And what I'm watching now as I'm teaching this week, I have 3 courses with about 35 students in each one. And so I've got a Zoom screen filled with faces. But what's changed since last fall and last spring is that their screens are always open now. They're all open, not black with just names. The faces are full of energy this week, full of passion, full of hope and energy and commitment. In my criminology course, they had a chat going the entire way down the screen, all class long, I think, about decriminalizing certain decriminalizing drugs, the role of police in society. And so while I'm lecturing and giving input, they're having their own conversation, which they could never do in person, but I was delighted because if they're talking about the course material, I could care less whether they're actually listening to me or not if they're engaging one another. And it was a wonderful thing. And I wondered to myself, what has happened? What has happened over the past year as this pandemic has persisted? Here's just an example of some of that running chat. It was long. I mean, it probably went for literally half an hour, but here's some of the things they were chatting about. These are direct quotes. I mean, this is good for those of us interested in working in activism and social change, which remain tied to criminal justice. I mean, we also ignore the fact that, like, police as an entity is based in either catching freed slaves or regulating POC, and this is stark and crushing in current social conditions. Old redlining still affects a lot of people today, too. I mean, these are different people going on and on and on. The corruption of the system is stronger than the corruption of the people in the system. Can't wait for the day that minor drugs are decriminalized everywhere, mainly nonviolent personal use of marijuana. But in my opinion, the solution, any nonviolent drug offender should be state-sponsored rehab from the money pooled from prisons. Throwing an addict in prison does not help them. Exactly, in capital letters. Like studies show that. Yeah, but they are doing crime because we made them. Like if their businesses weren't black markets. Caps, I agree. Like, true. And it went on and on like that. I've never in 3 decades of teaching, I've never seen so much energy for activism and advocacy among my students as I have this week. And it was the first sign that this pandemic that has sustained itself for nearly a year, international crises of this past year, of political polarization, of Black Lives Matter protests, of defund the police protest, of a violent attack on our Capitol, that all of these events, which we would never have asked for, might just be awakening a generation of students in a way that I doubted was possible. And then I remembered what I've always told my students. Students, suffering is our best teacher. In another course, when we were talking about some of these things, I pressed them on what was going on in terms of the resilience that I was observing in them. And why was this the case? And this was a direct quote from one of the students. Look, our generation has gone through a huge terrorist attack in our early developmental years, an economic crash in 07-08, several health scares like H1N1, Ebola, the bad flu year recently, along with us being exposed to the internet that flat out exposes us to everything happening, negative or positive, across the world. Later in the semester, I'll have my students read a book by Christian Smith called Lost in Transition, which is Smith's take on the millennial generation. And he calls his study a study of the dark side of millennials, in which he sees a generation saturated with self, saturated with or engaged in overconsumption, not concerned about the environment, disengaged from civil and political affairs, and more narcissistic than generations before them. And the data support this for millennials. And I saw it and heard from my students in the classroom. They say, that's us, that's us. But I've also experienced students this week, as I've said, like never before. Students now in the Generation Z or iGen generation cohort, who I wonder if because of the losses they've experienced, which they're very open about, the challenges they're facing, the uncertainty that they've lived with for now 18 to 20 years, the pandemic, the protests, the political uncertainty, I just wonder if the suffering isn't teaching them some lessons that harken way back to the generations that experienced World War II, the Great Depression, and so on. And if there isn't a shift taking place in them from darkness to light, from apathy to activism, from being self-focused to other and society-focused. I also, in my Intro to Sociology course, have my students read David Brooks' book, Road to Character, in which he argues that those who experienced World War II and the Great Depression were a different kind of generation, and that recent generations have gone soft, become narcissistic, and again, the data support that, more self-centered, and primarily focused on what he calls resume virtues rather than eulogy virtues. Those things are at the core of who we are. But seeing my students again this week, I'm beginning to wonder if we've not turned a bit of a corner with this generation. And if this generation isn't once again reflecting that truth that I've been teaching for a long time, that suffering will always be our best teacher. I'm more optimistic than I was a year ago. I'm more optimistic than I was 6 months ago or a couple of months ago. I'll reflect on my Facebook Live events. I'll reflect more on this in my Facebook Live event on February 1, Monday, a couple of days from now at 11:30, on how all of this relates to the church, because I think the church's response to the pandemic has in many ways been different, what I've experienced, than that of my students. And I wonder how that's going to turn out, both for my students and for the church in this time. So I look forward to for you to join me then if you can. If not, the video will be posted live later on Monday. Thanks again for joining the Church Dismantled community, and I'm honored to have you as part of it.